afternoon, everyone. So, yes, I'm going to give you a short introduction to the relevance of the European Green Deal for rural areas, just to set the scene for the meeting. So, as you all know, the Green Deal was published last December, and it sets out the key political objectives for the Commission for the next 5 years, focusing on economic growth and recovery more recently in response to COVID. But importantly, the whole of the Green Deal is underpinned by the principles of sustainability and a just transition, leaving no one behind. So you can see on the screen there, it outlines a whole range of policy initiatives and actions for achieving its objectives. And rural areas play a role in and are impacted in many of those. Most obviously, you have got initiatives like the EU Rural Vision, you have the Farm to Fork strategy and the biodiversity strategy. But I think it's important to look at some of those other elements that are in the bluey greeny boxes on the left hand side, because you've got a lot of initiatives that are related to climate and energy, either energy systems or renewable energy. You've got initiatives relating to the circular economy, to mobility and transport, and also to forestry. And all of those interact, all of these strategies and actions interact, and rural areas have a role to play in achieving the objectives that are set out in those strategies. So in terms of the CAP is a really important policy lever and source of financing to help steer the EU's rural areas onto a more sustainable pathway and meet these Green Deal objectives. It's the main source of funding that we have for land-based rural activities, and so it plays a really key role in achieving the Green Deal objectives related to agriculture and forest activities. And particularly in relation to achieving the climate and environmental outcomes required, but also doing that in a way that helps improve economic resilience and the social viability of rural areas and communities. So yes, you'll see there. So there are some targets that have been set out in the Farm to Fork and biodiversity strategies. Quite ambitious targets, and these are targets that need to be met to improve the sustainable management of rural land. And member states are going to have to identify how they can achieve those in their CAP strategic plans, and you'll hear more about that from Mike Mackenzie later. The 4 that are up there at the moment are common to both the Farm to Fork and the biodiversity strategy. And they relate to the 50% reduction in the overall use of pesticides and reducing nutrient losses by 50%. There's a target for increasing organic area by 25%, and a more general ambition to support a transition towards sustainable agricultural practices. The next 6 on the list there are additional ones from the biodiversity strategy only, but they're important to recognise because all of these are relevant to land use and could be funded or supported through the CAP in various ways. Particularly flag the ones on, there's a target relating to landscape features, having at least 10% of agricultural land under high diversity landscape features, increasing agroforestry practices, reducing the decline of genetic diversity and of pollinators, protecting soils, and a very ambitious tree planting requirement. So these are clearly going to be key targets that we're going to need to be looking at the CAP to deliver on as we move forward. But there is a lot more that the CAP can do to deliver these Green Deal objectives than just focusing on those targets in isolation. I think it's also important that we look at the bigger picture and see the interlinkages and connections between the Green Deal objectives and strategies and the actions that could be funded under the CAP, and how these can work together to strengthen economic, social, and the environmental resilience of rural areas more generally, looking beyond just land, but also thinking about supply chains and rural-urban interlinkages, for example. And I think it's important not to forget that delivering these or achieving these things successfully on the ground also requires a focus on new ways of working and thinking, both within governments and on the ground. And that's thinking about collaboration, thinking about joined up thinking, innovation, advisory capacity, and so on. So we mustn't forget that all of those governance and supporting factors are very important. So just coming back to today's meeting and the focus of this thematic group, I think it's going to be important when we have our discussions to focus not just on the topics that need to be focused through the CAP strategic plans and these very specific targets that have been identified, which are challenging enough to address on their own, but try and think about them and how they can be addressed, taking a broader perspective, thinking about their role in supporting rural economies and communities more generally.